Captain William Barnes of the Greycliffe made his official statement regarding the collision between his ferry and the Tahiti. Quote, "I called at Garden Island and picked up as usual, and was proceeding to Neilsen Park. I was hardly halfway between Garden Island and Neilsen Park, and was heading slightly north on Shark Island Light when I heard 2 blasts from a vessel. I looked on starboard side but saw nothing. I stepped across to the port side of the wheelhouse, and on looking astern, I saw Tahiti within a few feet of my port quarter aft. I had not seen or heard of the Tahiti previously."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Greycliffe is split in 2.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The 90-ton steam-powered ferry ship, the Greycliffe, had been built in 1911. She would go to work for the Sydney Ferry Company, sailing the waters of Port Jackson Bay between Circular Quay, Vaucluse, Parsley Bay, and Watson's Bay. It was a popular route, especially with schoolchildren who went to school in the city, leading it to be nicknamed the school boat when traveling her 413 route. This was certainly true at 4 in the afternoon on the 3rd of November, 1928, when the Greycliffe departed from Circular Quay a minute behind schedule with 125 passengers, many of whom were schoolchildren either returning from school or from a sports meeting held by the Public Schools Athletic Association at the cricket grounds. She was traveling under the command of Captain William Barnes. Captain Barnes was an experienced captain who knew the waters of Port Jackson Bay well, though he was just a relief captain on the Greycliffe. Her regular captain had the day off, and so Captain Barnes was at the helm. At about the same time that the Greycliffe was departing from Circular Quay, the 7,858-ton Union Line screw steamship was also departing, heading for New Zealand before heading on to San Francisco on her regular route. Her departure was not without incident. A young woman who was seeing off a friend, who was a passenger on the Tahiti, fell into the water, and an onlooker had to jump in to save her. They were both picked up by a boat, and it wouldn't have even made the papers, most likely, if the Tahiti had made it to New Zealand without incident. Instead, it would be held up by the papers as a sign that the Tahiti's departure had been marked with ill luck from the start. The departure of the Tahiti had not been delayed by the incident, and she continued on her way under the command of Captain Aldwell, but with the Sydney pilot Captain Carson steering her out of the harbour. On board, she had about 300 passengers. From Circular Quay, the Greycliffe headed for Garden Island, a voyage of about 8 minutes, and she stopped at Garden Island for about 2 minutes. As they departed from Garden Island, Captain Barnes gave the order, full speed ahead. They headed towards the north of Clark Island, and then their course took them in the direction of Shark Island Light. After about a mile, Captain Barnes noticed that they had swung slightly to port, only about 1/4 of a point, something he attributed to the fall of the rudder and the wind. He steadied the vessel and continued on his regular course, until he heard 2 blasts of a whistle. He looked behind him from where he was standing in the forward pilot house, on the starboard side near the telegraph. From there he could see nothing. He crossed over to look out of the port side of the wheelhouse, and he saw the bows of the Tahiti on the port quarter aft, only a few feet from his vessel. It would later be claimed that the window on the port side had been too dirty for him to look out of, and that is why he had not seen anything earlier, but Captain Barnes denied that it was the case. Another ferry, the Woollahra, which traveled on the same route as the Greycliffe, had been seen coming from the other direction, and her captain would later say that at that moment it had seemed that a collision was inevitable. Captain Barnes would say that as he had been stepping across, a wave had hit the stern of the Greycliffe and had swung the vessel to port. Captain Barnes had quickly returned to the wheel and swung the wheel over to starboard, but it did not take effect immediately, certainly not quickly enough to prevent the Tahiti from plunging into the Greycliffe. There would be much discussion about the steering of the Greycliffe. The two ships had been traveling side by side, both at their full speed. What this meant on the Tahiti would later be discussed. The court asked if this had meant the ship had been going 12 knots, which would have been her full speed normally, but had been told no, she had been traveling 6 knots, which was disputed by witnesses. Exactly how fast she was actually going is uncertain, but the courts would later determine it had been too fast for where they were. The two ships were about 200 feet apart as they passed Garden Island, with the Greycliffe being about a ship's length ahead, according to Second Officer Gibson on the Tahiti. It was not unusual for the Greycliffe to encounter ships that were coming and going from Sydney Harbour. Indeed, her course took her right across the route these ships took. But this time, the Greycliffe had suddenly swung directly into the course of the Tahiti. On the Tahiti, the pilot, Captain Carson, gave the order to stop port, stop starboard, and then full speed astern, all within a few seconds of each other. The Tahiti began to swing towards Bradley's Head, but the Greycliffe was swinging more and more into their path. Captain Barnes would initially say that the Greycliffe had not had any problems with her steering more than was normal for ships of her sort, but then had pointed to the ship turning a quarter point to port earlier. Maybe there was something wrong with her steering after all. He said that normally, when she was traveling at low speeds, she would pull to port, but when traveling at full steam, as she had been when she collided with the Tahiti, she pulled to starboard a bit, and he knew to expect that. This had been different. On board the Tahiti, many passengers did not realize what had happened at first, even after the ships collided. The relatively tiny and fragile wooden ferry had come across as a very slight bump as the much larger steel hull of the Tahiti had demolished her. Many of the passengers had remained on deck for their departure from Sydney, and it was only when they heard screams and saw wreckage beginning to fill the water that they realized the horror of what was unfolding. For those on board the Greycliffe, it seemed as though the ship they were on had been smashed to splinters, but she actually had been cut in half. Both halves began to sink almost immediately, before some people even had time to realize what was happening. On one half of the ship, the boiler exploded as the engine was flooded, adding to the chaos and destruction. Captain Barnes was nearly trapped in the wheelhouse, but he was able to escape through an open window before he went down with his ship. Some of the passengers on the Greycliffe had realized that the Tahiti was about to strike them. Mr. J. Corby had been on a trip with his wife and 6-year-old daughter to Watson's Bay. They had been sitting on the top deck and talking when they had been alerted by some women screaming. On turning around, Corby had seen the Tahiti almost on top of them and had jumped up to get his wife and daughter lifebelts while shouting for his wife to run. She rushed down the gangway, and Corby had been trying to follow after her when the collision had occurred. Corby had been thrown into the water and was able to reach the surface where he was picked up by the steam ferry, the Kaula, which had rushed to the scene to help. He had survived. His wife and daughter had not. They had been trapped below the deck, as had many other people. That Corby had managed to get a lifebelt set him apart from many of the other passengers. It was later observed that one of the cruel ironies of the wreck was that a rack full of untouched lifebelts had floated to the surface of the water with the other wreckage. If people had had time, they could have saved many lives, but there simply had not been time. It was estimated that half of the Greycliffe that had remained afloat the longest had still only been afloat for about 3 minutes. The shade that had covered the deck floated for longer, however, giving the illusion to some that the Greycliffe had been partially submerged, even though it had almost immediately gone to the bottom like a stone. There were so many pieces floating in the water that many of the passengers were under the impression that the ship had been smashed to pieces, not cut in half by the Tahiti. The ladies' cabin would also eventually float ashore, having separated from the hull at some point, a grim reminder to everyone of the disaster that had taken place. The aft pilot house also floated among the wreckage, accompanied by many personal items of passengers, which would be collected in the hopes of identifying who had been lost. Fred Jones, who had been collecting fares in the men's cabin, had glanced out of the port windows just before the collision and had shouted for passengers to get out of the cabin before running towards the engine room. Passenger Eric Dalen had been on the upper deck, facing aft, and reading a paper when he glanced up to discover the bow of the Tahiti towering above him, though he had no time to react before the collision. It would soon all be pandemonium as parents grabbed their children and everyone tried to escape from the ferry. In the water, a schoolgirl was forced to swim frantically out of the way as the propeller of the Tahiti barely missed her. A schoolboy nearby had been dragged down by the sinking ferry, but had been able to return to the surface. Many of the people in the water were injured by debris or were in shock. All across the area, various boats and ferries converged on the scene to offer what help they could, including the Woollahra, which picked up Captain Barnes. The Kaula and the water police launched the Cambria under the command of Sergeant William Shakespeare. Sergeant Shakespeare would later distinguish himself in the rescue efforts, as what had been a regular patrol turned into a frantic search for survivors in a matter of moments. It took time to determine just how many were missing on the Greycliffe. The victims' ages ranged from 2 to 81, and included businessmen, students, doctors, teachers, parents, and grandparents. The newspapers listed one man among those missing, only to have him arrive at the police station that night and declare that he was alive and well. His briefcase had been on the ferry, but he had not. Divers got to work almost immediately, dismantling the hull of the Greycliffe to retrieve the remains of those who had been lost. It was emotionally exhausting work, as they found people who had been trapped or fatally injured, and then were forced to try to find family or friends to identify them. It was finally determined that 40 people had been lost in the tragic accident, and 54 people were injured and rushed to the hospital. It remains the worst disaster to occur in Sydney Harbour. Determining exactly what had happened would take much longer. The cases coming from the disaster would stretch on for the next 4 years. The initial investigations were delayed by the departure of the Tahiti. The Tahiti did aid with rescue work, but with that done, they departed. An inspection of the vessel found that there were only some long scratches in the paint to show that she had been in a collision. With nothing structurally wrong with the ship, she had continued on her voyage. Many of her passengers spoke to the papers before she left, and spoke of the horror they felt. One passenger said that the moments before the collision were the last time that she had laughed. The pilot, Captain Carson, was still available to answer questions, even with the Tahiti gone. As he faced the inquiries, the events and the scrutiny clearly began to wear on him. At an inquest hearing on the 6th of February, Captain Carson snapped that, quote, "I stand here a ruined man as a result of the action of the ferry steamer." It was clear where Captain Carson placed the blame, but others were not so sure. As victims and the families of victims filed cases for damages, the courts began to put both shipping companies down as being liable, pending a determination of fault. This held everyone in a limbo that became increasingly frustrating for the general public. The problem came down to what had caused the ferry to suddenly end up in the path of the Tahiti. There was an argument for some time by the representatives of the ferry company that the suction of the bow wave of the Tahiti had dragged the ferry in, a documented phenomenon. This argument would place the blame on Captain Carson for having the Tahiti traveling too quickly in the harbor and too close to the Greycliffe. They do not seem to have offered enough evidence that this was the cause for the court's satisfaction, however. In the end, it was determined that both the Tahiti and the Greycliffe were responsible for what had occurred. Justice Rogers determined that the fault lay 2/3 with the Greycliffe and 1/3 with the Tahiti, and things were to be settled accordingly. After 4 years of legal battles, it was a decision that was announced at the bottom of page 9 of the Sydney Morning Herald. The remains of the Greycliffe had long since been disposed of after an attempt to auction them off with no takers. The only part of the ferry that was salvaged was her engines, which were taken to New Zealand, where they were installed in the New Zealand Cooperative Dairy Company to drive ammonia compressors and churn butter. Once they were retired, they were donated to the Museum of Transport and Technology, where it remains on display to this day, the final piece of the Greycliffe. For more information, please see the Sydney Morning Herald from November 4th, 1927, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.